Hey folks, Mark Scroggins with another edition of the Reclamation Transformation. And today I have Cindy Hyde with me. Cindy, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Mark?
I am good, thank you. So Cindy is a therapist who I send a number of my clients to that are dealing with all of these hot button issues
Mm-hmm.
today of so-and-so's a narcissist, or it's part of the Dark Triad, or any one of a number of things. So
Right.
all these not just scary terminology,
Mm-hmm.
but really scary situations.
Right.
So, why don't you describe your practice a little
Okay.
bit for everybody who's out there?
Okay. Well, I'm Cindy Hyde. I own Living Strong Counseling here in North Dallas. And who I predominantly work with are mostly women, but women who have gone through what most people call a toxic relationship or a narcissistically abusive relationship. But in actuality, what they're called is pathological love relationships. And so that's my core client. But I also work a lot of times because a lot of times in these relationships, there's infidelity. And so I also work with spouses or partners that have been betrayed in their relationships while also enduring the toxicity that can come with being in a pathological love relationship. So that's predominantly what I do.
So, and that is, as you know, something that is prevalent in my practice as a divorce lawyer.
Yeah.
So, um, and
Yeah.
narcissism has
Yeah.
been one of those things that is the $50 word right now.
Right.
Everybody and their dog thinks that
Right.
the other person's a narcissist. And I love it when they come in,
Correct.
he or she is a textbook narcissist.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
it's like, holy shit. Can we lose the Google aspect of this a little bit and start
Right.
talking about,
Right.
what we're really dealing
Right.
with? Because this is something that is super difficult for courts to identify. And even if the courts
Mm-hmm.
do identify it, I think a lot of the time they're not really they're not really geared to deal with it.
Right. Exactly.
So as we've talked about, in divorce cases, the more money there is, the closer to a 50-50 division there's going to be,
For sure.
regardless of fault.
Right.
And so when we're talking about stuff like this and we get into things like gaslighting and, other behavior,
Mm-hmm.
someone who, one of my favorite terms, a crisis junkie,
Yeah.
you know, um, courts want to, I think, kind of default to he or she is crazy, or he
Mm-hmm.
or she is just a major pain in the ass kind of
Right.
thing, a
Right.
bad behaviorist.
Right.
But let's jump into what you termed as pathological love
Okay.
relationships
Right.
and talk about what those are
Mm-hmm.
specifically.
Okay. Well, and you're absolutely correct, Mark. The word narcissist is grossly overused.
Right.
And pretty much it applies to everybody today. I can't tell you how many calls I get that the first thing they say is, "I think I've been involved with a narcissist," and it's possible. It is possible. However, sometimes it's worse than that.
Right.
Sometimes they're actually with a psychopath or a sociopath, or somebody that could have all three.
Right.
And so, the unfortunate part is I can't diagnose the person they're telling me about because I've never met them.
Right.
However, I can work with the client to try to figure out, by using some DSM checklists to find out.
And when you say DSM, just for
DSM
those,
is the diagnostic manual that I use to diagnose, or
Right.
that most therapists or psychologists, psychiatrists use to diagnose.
Right.
And so I can help them come to their own conclusion of what is possible that they've been dealing with. But the probability, a lot of times the high manipulation, the egocentricity, which is the all about me, the pathological lying, all of that isn't necessarily narcissism. It can be psychopathy or psychopath, right? The irrational, explosive behavior can actually be borderline personality disorder or sociopath and not narcissist. So it's really important. So I follow the Institute of Relational Harm Reduction, which is where I've gotten all of my training, and they've done 30 years of research. They did studies with Purdue University. And what they termed, what most people call a narcissistic abusive relationship, is actually a pathological love relationship,
Okay.
which means they've been in a relationship with somebody that has pathology. So pathology meaning what's termed in the DSM as the Dark Triad is antisocial or sociopath, psychopath, or narcissistic personality disorder.
How do those differ? And one thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about some of the differences between those three, but additionally, borderline personality disorder. Wanted to talk about that because in my experience, those have been the hardest ones for me to deal with, whether I'm representing that person or
Correct.
whether I've got that person on the other side of a case, because it seems like they've got their own little world.
Right.
And if it doesn't, and I don't mean that in a,
true.
you know, in a funny fashion, really, although it can be. But it's like, if it doesn't fit into what their perceived reality is, holy shit.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
just, you know, watch out because there's something big coming.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, and borderline specifically can be those really high emotions.
Right.
Right. And so their biggest fear is abandonment or rejection. And so if that gets triggered, you're going to see a really high emotion come from that, whether it's rage or a meltdown. And so sometimes it's really difficult to get them back to center if they feel that trigger or they feel they're not being supported by people. But really the difference between what's considered the Dark Triad, which is sociopath, psychopath, or narcissistic personality disorder, is I often tell my clients, like, sociopath is that, you know, they're the ones getting in physical fights. They're the ones that are really explosive also. They also, they're really deceitful. So they kind of fly just under the letter of the law. So like if you had a restraining order that said you can't be within 500 feet of me, they would be at 501.
Right.
And they would be like, I wasn't at 500 feet, right? And they're the ones that might, like, you know, set your trash can on fire or do something, you know, somewhat criminal. A psychopath is kind of a sociopath on steroids. And so what they did, what they can have criminal versatility. So they're the ones that they may go to jail and still blame the victim that it's their fault for whatever bad behavior they had. They're not always criminal, though. You know, there's about 25 possibilities that could be checkboxed on whether they're a psychopath or not. And the DSM only requires that 10 be checked. And so they may or may not be criminal, but they could still have a lot of really bad behavior, like the pathological lying, the manipulativeness, all of those things. Where the narcissist, the true narcissist, the narcissistic personality disorder is actually the one that's more grandiose. They're the ones that are very image conscious. They, just like the psychopath and the sociopath, they don't have the ability to have empathy for the amount of harm they're doing. And so they're a little different in that way. They're not always, they can be manipulative and they can definitely lie too, but are they pathological in their lying?
Right.
So, you know, you asked me a question once before about, well, how do you know if they're not just, you know, a jerk or an a-hole or something like that, right? How do you know?
Right.
Well, the way you know is if there's enduring patterns over time. So if, you know, the pathological lying, the cheating, the manipulation, the gaslighting, all of those, if they're happening over the course of time, then that makes them an enduring pattern. And so that means that they're lasting. And so that's how you tell the difference.
So let me ask you this. If, you know, let's say that I thought that I had a case that the other side was, you know, one of these folks in the Dark Triad. And so what would you think would be the best way for me as a divorce lawyer to really show the court that this person is not just an asshole with his spouse, okay? And I'm using traditional gender roles because I think it falls that way more.
Sure.
Isn't that correct?
Yeah, it is more predominantly men. However, it's not uncommon at all nowadays for it to actually be a female that has pathology. It's a smaller range, but it does happen.
I'd heard that borderline you see more with women. It's the others that are more male.
Yeah, that's
based.
correct.
Okay. So if you were assisting me, if I brought you in as a consulting expert on a case and I'm telling you, okay, help me teach this judge what we're looking at and what is really important for this judge to understand, to really identify with just the hell
Right.
that our collective client has had to deal with in being married to this guy.
Right.
What would you say that, here's what we really want to get across to the court?
Right. Well, one would be history. Have
Okay.
there been patterns over time?
And this could be through multiple relationships.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
In addition to that, hopefully, your client would have had very good documentation and kept factual information recorded. I know recordings aren't always admissible in court, but at least, you as the attorney would be able to hear the abuse for yourself so that you would know how to present it to the judge. But it is all about enduring patterns. It's, have they been presenting this way over a period of time? You could court order, a psychological eval too, but the problem with that is they lie. So
Yeah.
you don't know if you're getting accurate information, and it's not uncommon for them to be incredibly smart.
Right.
And so because of that, they can, manipulate the test because they are master manipulators.
Right.
And so it really comes down to what documentation does the client have, or can she prove that happened. So,
Document.
So if there's an explosive rage, don't be afraid to call the authorities and have it documented that way. If they've been abusive to your child, don't be afraid to, it's hard to say don't be afraid because they're terrified inside the relationship. But if they're looking at an exit plan, to have any kind of documentation they can have would be, the way to go. And also too, to be seeing their own therapist, so the therapist can be documenting their trauma from being in a pathological love relationship.
Now, is that something that if you were treating someone who had been subjected to all this, is it a situation where you might invite the other person into the therapy at all?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No, and that's because you would be putting the abuser in the same room with the victim.
Okay.
And so the first order of business for me when I work with someone like that is to assess the level of trauma that I'm dealing with, because it shows up. It absolutely affects their executive functioning. So a lot of times you'll hear, and a lot of times the interesting part is they're very successful women, but yet they've found themselves in these relationships, these PLR relationships. And all of a sudden their executive functioning isn't working anymore. They aren't going to work like they were. They can't think straight. And so there's all these little indicators from a trauma standpoint that will show that these women have been traumatized. And so, and it shows up too with PTSD.
So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail, because one of the things so here's where my thought process is going. If I've got to kind of educate the judiciary on this, because I think that is something that I don't think they have been educated on it. And, but helping them to understand how it actually shows up and what behavior of the victim would tend to show that they are going through all of this, and then when you couple it with testimony or documentary evidence, or as you said, recordings and stuff, which, luckily Texas is a one recorder state.
Right.
So I couldn't sit here and put something under the table and walk out and record you, and that would be a no-no. That'd be a wiretapping violation.
Right.
But if I wanted to sit here and record it, whether you know about it or not, I'm in the clear of doing
That's
that.
good to
So document.
Absolutely.
So make sure you are writing stuff down. If one other thing that I wanted to mention is people forget. So a lot of everybody's heard this on TV or in the movies of assault and battery. Okay, Texas doesn't have battery. Texas has assault. All right. And so assault has two different pieces. Assault is one where somebody gets their ass whipped. All right. That's an assault.
Right.
But if I tower over you for a second and I'm yelling and screaming and you are in reasonable fear of imminent bodily injury, that's an assault. And people forget that. Oh, well, he never did that to me. He did.
Right.
Well, did you feel like you were about to get hit?
Yeah.
Well, yes. That's an assault.
Right.
Okay. And those are game changers when you get down to child custody matters, when you
Right.
get down to division of the marital estate. It even gets into opening up the door for getting spousal maintenance, which is, it's presumed you shouldn't get it in Texas.
Right.
So, but being able, I think, to explain this to a judge of, look, here's how she is presenting. And then here is this documented history, not just through the spouse right now, but additionally these previous relationships.
Right.
And this, Judge, is why this is important because, I mean, frankly, I think we were just hearing before, the UK has got some stuff with coercive control, and Hawaii just put something in place, and I think New York is trying to put something in place.
Yes, correct.
Hopefully we can get some other states to put something in place, although I see a lot of pushback coming from that because it's kind of a slippery slope. How do you tell what is real and what is not? Right.
Well, I like to use the power and control wheel, which is what a lot of domestic violence centers use. And by using that, you're not just looking at whether or not there was physical or sexual assault. You're also looking at the emotional and psychological abuse as well. And so a lot of times what happens to these victims is and where the word coercive control comes in, is they're isolated away from friends and family very early in the love bombing stage and the grooming stage. And a lot of people...
Let me stop you there for just half a second. So what I want to try to do, because there's so much great information here, is if we can kind of try to create a verbal checklist for people. So we've talked about document. Don't be afraid to document anything, whether it's in, your own personal diary, whether it's calling the police, recording stuff. And then what you were just saying here. And so if you can go through that again.
Yeah. And so a lot of times what a pathological person will do is they operate very much like a cult leader does. And so they'll do an early grooming and they almost test their victim to see if the victim will be agreeable to some bad behavior. And that's one of the things they look for, is agreeableness. And so they'll do something a little shady or bad, and they'll see if the victim actually agrees to it or gives them a pass for that bad behavior, and then they're just like, oh, check, got them. And so then
it's like it's fun to be bad.
It's fun to be bad, right? And so so that's kind of what they do, is they do an early grooming and they start isolating them away from friends and family. So
what does that look like to somebody?
And so they may start telling you they don't like how your mother treats you, or they don't like how your friend's husband behaves, or they don't like certain things about the people that you're associating with. And they're looking again to see if you'll be agreeable enough to start alienating yourself away from those people.
Gotcha.
And so what they're trying to do is get you where you're only dependent on them. And so they look for people with very high empathy. So no matter how successful you are, if you have high empathy, you're a target. And so they look for that very early to see if you'll, basically buy their reality that your friends and family are bad, and then you become totally dependent on them. So that's one of the red flags to look for. And I tell a lot of my single clients, if they're trying to isolate you, you need to run.
Yeah, feet don't fail me now.
Exactly. And so, but they very much use tactics like a cult leader would. Yeah.
That's so incredibly scary.
It is.
So now the question that I have, I mean, so trying to think of all of this empirical evidence that we can put out there so that a court can connect the dots. How do we get past the supposition, if I'm on the other side of that, okay, I'm going to say, look, my client's an asshole. But just because he's an asshole doesn't mean that he's actually doing X, Y, or Z. He's not really gaslighting. Look, Judge, you can tell she's crazy, or this, that, or the other. So how do we overcome that?
Yeah, because a lot of times the victims do look crazy in court because, there's little things that can be said that the victim knows what's being said to her, but nobody else in the courtroom does. And so he's actually provoking her right there in the courtroom, causing her to melt down or get enraged. And so she looks like the crazy one when in actuality he's standing there looking smooth as silk. Right. And so that becomes a problem, because then the judge looks at her and goes, well, maybe you are the one, right? And so it becomes a he said, she said, and who's telling the truth here. So it really does, again, come down to enduring patterns, what has happened over time that can be documented and proved. And so, I always tell my clients, make sure it's factual, don't ad lib or add assumptions, just be sure it's factual and keep really good notes of what's happening. But most of the time, the goal is to get them out of those relationships. And one way to also, to tell if PTSD is present is if the partner keeps going back. Because oftentimes, and I was telling you, you and I were talking about this at one point, that in typical PTSD, like if you had gone to war, Mark, and you came back, all of your trauma, your flashbacks, your rumination, all of it would be on the negative event that happened. With a partner that's been in a pathological love relationship, her trauma is atypical PTSD, meaning that not only does she have negative memories and flashbacks, she has positive ones. And so her brain goes into cognitive dissonance and wants to believe the good, like maybe this time, maybe the love bombing's true, and maybe this time he's telling the truth and he's going to really change. But her brain forgets that litany of bad behavior that's been present. And so it's actually a PTSD response, where a lot of therapists over the course of history have labeled it codependency, when in actuality it's not. It's PTSD.
So that's, codependency is another one of those taglines right now. Which is, it's much farther reaching than I really understood, before I'd been coached up quite a bit on it. But it's interesting. So how do we discern between it being codependency and it being someone who's actually suffering from PTSD because of, this particular pathological love relationship that they're involved in?
Right. And so it's really a difference between codependency and a trauma bond, right? Which is another buzzword nowadays, right? And so codependency usually gets started in an adverse childhood. And so they learn to become dependent on other people. And so people are kind of their obsession, like they want to either overhelp or over control, or I'll just people please, and that way they'll do what it is I'm wanting, or I won't get that reaction. Where a trauma bond gets created because of a high intensity relationship, right? But the where codependency kind of gets overused even in the therapeutic world is because if they've been in a pathological relationship, the research shows about 60% of the victims in a pathological relationship have what's called super traits and not codependency. Super traits meaning being highly agreeable, meaning over trusting, over loyal, right? It could mean that they're very successful and driven, called conscientiousness, but they don't have boundaries with that conscientiousness. And so they can get targeted, meaning if they have conscientiousness, they're not going to give up easily. Right?
Gotcha.
Where if they're codependent, they had an adverse childhood. A lot of the population that become victims didn't necessarily have an adverse childhood.
Right.
And so that's new research that's out there now. And so that's kind of where a lot of therapists that have been trained now in these pathological love relationships are learning that not all clients are going to come in codependent. They may come in with just super traits that got them targeted.
Let me ask you some questions about a trauma bond, because that's really interesting to me. It just kind of provokes some thought on my as you know, I've been sober for quite a while, but there was some time when I was not. that let's say my behavior was not quite as good as it is today.
Right.
And so, I mean, but would that be a situation where you can see a trauma bond created in a situation like that, but it doesn't necessarily give rise to what we're talking about with a pathological love relationship, but it's somebody that's suffering from, drug or alcohol abuse, and they're trying, or maybe they're not trying, but because of that, they find themselves in, and I'm talking about the couple finds themselves in these bad situations. It's just you and me against the world. We're going to get through this,
Right.
yada, yada, yada. And so you've got a trauma bond that actually can be created in that scenario.
And the relationship can be somewhat addictive.
Right.
So like in your case, you could have been addicted to alcohol,
Right.
and your spouse could have been addicted to you.
Right.
Right. And so had you split up, then she may have been trauma bonded to you because of the intensity that was created in that relationship.
Okay.
And so she could have either had codependency, meaning she became dependent on you,
Right.
and or if you had been, a pathological person, and thank God you're not, but had you been,
Right.
She could have had, if she didn't have an adverse childhood, she could have just had the super traits that you saw early on. But a trauma bond is created from the high intensity in a relationship, the constant push pull. Are you in this? Are you not in this? And so it creates in the victim almost an addiction to longing for that person. And so,
that's not specific to it having to be a sexual relationship either. So
not necessarily.
So I had a case not long ago where there were sisters that had a trauma bond from, their childhood was just abhorrent.
Right.
And, we represented some other family members, but you look at that and I was just amazed because it's something that doesn't logically make sense. It's like, why would you be putting that person ahead of your own child? And so just very interesting to me.
Yeah, which shows the addictive quality of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon, like in an actual marital relationship or partnership, if there's infidelity, there can be trauma bonds created because there's so much intensity around the affairs or affairs, yeah.
So that's interesting. So something else I want to talk about here where we talked a little bit about, or I brought up the term a crisis junkie. And you told me about, it's somebody who's always, stirring the pot. There's always some shit happening.
Yep.
So let's talk about a little bit what that looks like, because I want to continue this idea of a verbal checklist of ladies, if you're running into any of these, feet don't fail me now. You need to hurry up and haul ass.
For sure. Yeah. And so what the Institute of Relational Harm Reduction says is this, that a normal person like you and I, we see a problem, we assess a problem, we solve the problem, right?
Yep.
Somebody that has pathology, so either psychopath, antisocial sociopath, or narcissistic personality disorder, which is considered the Dark Triad in the DSM. And it used to be called the erratic and dramatic personality disorders, or a character disorder.
Right.
And so what a personality disordered person will do is they will create the problem. They'll stir in some erratic and dramatic. And then when that starts to fizzle out, they'll create a new problem. So there's always a new problem. And when I explain this to clients, they're just like, yeah, there's always a new problem.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing too, if you're dating someone and there's always a new problem, that should be a red flag for you, to move on, because that's not going to change. That is very likely going to stay the same.
Gotcha.
And so too, a lot of clients ask me, will it ever get better? Do they have the ability to change? And the truth is that the chances are so tiny, because 97% of the people that are on the Dark Triad, so the pathological people on the Dark Triad, 97% of that population were born that way. They don't have the ability to change. 3% of that population, the reason they became that was environmental. So maybe they really did have a horrific childhood.
Right.
But what happens is the neural pathways change. And when the neural pathways change, their brain is changed.
Right.
And so the way that the Institute of Relational Harm Reduction talks about it is to look at it like this: if someone was born with autism, right, at the end of the day, they're going to die and still have autism,
Right.
right?
Yep.
It's the same with the Dark Triad, and much of the research now points to that, but so many people don't know that
Right.
that if they're born on the Dark Triad, they're going to die on the Dark Triad, which means there is no hope for change.
Let me ask this, when you're saying no hope for change, because there's been so much that has gone on recently with the use of psychedelics in treatment, specifically because of the rewiring of the brain that goes on. Have there been any studies with anybody that is suffering from the Dark Triad and the use of psychedelics in any type of treatment protocol?
Psychedelics are used predominantly for trauma and PTSD. So
Right.
that would probably be more something geared towards the victim versus the person with pathology. Although I think I might reach out to Gilmore Mate and ask him to do that study. But anyway, no, not that I'm aware of, but I think it would be an excellent study to do. But the problem is if you can get somebody that identifies as being pathological, because a lot of times they don't think anything's wrong with them.
Right.
Well, in fact, the majority of the time, it's everybody else that has the problem. It's not them. And so a lot of times they won't go to therapy. They won't even, they won't even admit there is a problem. So.
What do their personal relationships look like?
Yeah, sometimes they can be married a very long time, but most of the time they're not in a monogamous situation. Most of the time there is infidelity involved, especially if they fall in psychopathy because they have that high sexual impulsivity.
Right.
But normally there's a string of relationships along the way.
And with that would carry over to non-sexual relationships as well. They've got
Absolutely.
somebody that they immediately bond with, that's their best friend ever, and they just are so alike, and then somebody pisses them off and they're just discarded, out of hand.
Yeah. And I have a friend that was actually stalked by a female, what she thought was a best friend, when she started realizing how crazy it was becoming, and she tried to end the friendship. The other person actually stalked her. And that can happen too, because, they don't like to lose. If they have pathology, they don't like to lose, so they're the ones that will stalk someone. And so that happens all the time.
So a couple other areas I wanna hit on a little bit, and folks, we're gonna have Cindy coming back as a recurring guest because there's so much to talk about on all of this. But you've got the power and control wheel, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. And I also wanted to talk about this list, the survivor tool that you have, the partner related traits of pathometry checklist, and so that we can start looking at if someone, I guess my first thing would be to say, trust yourself. And so if you're feeling a certain way, it probably makes sense to talk to someone like you or somebody else to say, holy shit, I'm feeling a little crazy here. Is this really happening? But to understand kind of how these people present.
Yep. And so what happens a lot of times, like I was telling you earlier, a lot of times they'll groom just like a cult leader does. And so their goal is to learn everything they can about you. And so a lot of people don't know, and especially in the single world today, they'll go out and vomit their story to somebody they don't know at all. And that person's sitting there going, oh, good, I'm going to use that. And so you don't want to tell people you don't know personal details about yourself, because it could get used against you later.
Right.
And so, trust is earned. It's not one of those things that you just blanketly hand out, and that happens a lot. And so what somebody with pathology will do, like if they find out that your father abandoned you or something like that, then later on down the road, they may say, well, I can see why your father left you. right? And so that can be very harmful to a victim because it's taking their deepest wound and it's being turned into a knife and they're being stabbed with it, right?
Right. Yep.
And so that's called devaluing, and they start devaluing usually about mid-relationship. And so they'll start finding ways to break them down. And so they're hitting on points that the victim already feels. Well, I already feel like I was the reason my father left me. And so maybe he's right. And so that's how they get leverage, is because the victim starts believing the things that they're being told from a devaluing standpoint. And
Wow.
so the Institute of Relational Harm Reduction developed what's called a pathometry checklist that I use with clients, because I can't diagnose a pathological partner because I don't know them.
Right.
And a lot of times too, like I said before, even if they were given some sort of evaluation, there's no way to know if it's truthful or not.
Right.
But the pathometry checklist, what it does is it allows the traumatized person, the victim, or ultimately they become a survivor, actually. But it allows the survivor to look for themselves and base it on what the DSM says are pathological characteristics. So it breaks down what exactly a sociopath or an antisocial personality disorder person does. It breaks out what a psychopath does. It breaks out what a borderline person does, and it breaks out what a narcissistic personality disordered person does. And it's really validating for the clients to see that this was not them. They were in a pathological love relationship with somebody that was personality disordered very plausibly.
Well, and so this is the list that we are talking about here, and it's fantastic. And so if anybody out there wants a copy of it, reach out to us. You can always send something to info@Scroggins Law Group, and we'll get that to you. But one other thing I wanted to talk about real briefly is if we can identify a little bit of the differences between the antisocial or sociopath, the psychopath,
Right.
and the narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah. And so a lot of times a sociopath, the rules don't apply to them.
Right.
Right. And so they have a failure to conform to social lawful norms. Right. So I always tell clients, like, if your city has a no fireworks code, they'll shoot off fireworks anyway because the rules don't apply to them.
Right.
Right. And so there's a high deceitfulness there. They also have, they're usually the ones that are in fistfights in the local bar. They oftentimes have an inconsistent work behavior. So you'll hear victims say, yeah, he kept changing jobs, or he hasn't worked in however long, and they don't necessarily honor their financial obligations. So that's kind of one way that you can also tell if it's somebody that's a sociopath.
Is it fair to say that they're the ones generally that are the more physically dangerous?
They can be, yeah.
Okay.
Between them and psychopaths can be very physically dangerous too. But they also, just like the rest of them, they lack remorse if they hurt you. They don't feel they don't have the ability to feel your pain because they don't have empathy or compassion.
Right.
That's not emotions they can feel. A psychopath is more manipulative. They're very insecure. They pathologically lie. They also have grandiosity like the narcissist. So, I always say it's narcissist plus, right? When you're looking at a psychopath. But they have a constant need for stimulation. They're the ones that usually have the very high sexual impulsivity and can also be into sex addiction as well. They have no remorse whatsoever. So, they could murder you and somehow that was your fault. Right. And so they're the ones that can have the criminal versatility, but not always. I mean, they can have everything but the criminal versatility and still be considered a psychopath. And so they can also have that parasitic lifestyle. And a lot of clients will say, what does that mean? And I'll say, well, do they suck the life out of you?
Right.
And so, but they can suck the life out of you financially too. So it's not just emotionally. And sometimes too, a way to tell is if they had early behavioral problems So for instance, if they had been in juvie, or their mom told you, like, they were always in trouble, they used to throw these big fits all the time, so there was early behavioral history there. Sometimes
Harming animals, things of that sort.
yeah, things like that, yeah.
Right.
And so now, borderline is, we kind of talked about that already.
Right.
That's
Yep.
that high emotionality. But narcissism, this is where people get really confused and where it gets overused, because really a lot of times the things that they're describing are actually psychopathy and not necessarily narcissism, although they can all overlap. So
Right.
narcissism is that grandiose sense of importance. A lot of times they'll attach to high status people, because that makes them look more important. They're all about image. They believe that they're special and unique, and they require excessive admiration. They have a very big sense of entitlement. And so they usually expect like favorable treatment when they haven't really done anything to earn that.
Right.
They can be very exploitive in relationships. So they don't mind exploiting their lawyer girlfriend to help them in court with their most recent ex, right? So,
Yep.
they'll do things like that. So they'll exploit the person they're with. So if they see a person that maybe makes a lot of money, they'll attach to them, and try to drain them dry,
Right.
And exploit that person. And it'll always be a sob story of how they need help financially or whatever. But they lack empathy, and they're incredibly arrogant.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because everybody knows about the people, I refer to them as soul suckers.
Yeah.
Where it's
Exactly.
just like, oh my God, give me a break for just a little while because
Yeah.
I've got absolutely
Right.
nothing left. Well, let's talk a little bit about the power and control before we get
Right.
finished up
Yeah.
today, because those are really, really interesting to me. And I think it's important to understand these of, using coercion and threats and intimidation and emotional abuse and isolation and then just how. So how does all of this work together, and what do you use this for in your treatment of others?
So normally this is one of the first things I do, and I'll read through this with the client to see if she's experienced any of these things. So, just for people that don't know, it's what domestic violence centers use to determine abuse.
Right.
Whether it has physical elements or sexual elements to it or not, it determines abuse. And so the majority of it is psychological or emotional.
Right.
So it's like, they've used intimidation with you to intimidate you into doing what you want them to do or that they want you to do. They use emotional abuse, calling you names or devaluing you. They use isolation, getting you away from friends and family. They minimize, deny, and blame and blame shift their behavior back onto you. So if you have an issue, the issue never gets solved and they minimize it. They'll use your children against you. Well, your mother's not letting me do whatever it is. And when in
Right.
actuality, they're the ones that have created the problem. They've created that problem we talked about. They also use what's called male privilege, which is becoming the god of the house. They're the only one that has a say-so in the house. And then using economic abuse. Oftentimes they won't let their partners have any access to money, or they'll use all of their money. They'll have the partner working when they're not working, and they'll
Right.
be taking their money and not letting the partner have any of the money. So, and then of course, coercive threats. They'll use fear and threats to, I'm going to hurt your family.
Right.
Or I'm going to tell your mother that you had an abortion, or they'll do things to keep the partner in fear.
So
Right.
one other thing that I wanted to ask along those lines is well, you know what? Damn it. I think I just forgot what I was going to ask you there. But, now I do know what it was. So, we hear these questions about why did it take her so long to leave?
Yeah.
Why did she keep going back? When in all actuality, it should be, why is this guy doing what he's doing, or
Right.
whoever the abuser is, because it can be
Right.
on the other side as well. But I'd like for you to explain kind of what happens when a person is subjected to this type of behavior. And so why you keep seeing the repetitiveness of someone going back 5, 6, 7 times before they can get the hell out of the relationship finally.
Well, because in the early grooming stage, what's happening is what is cognitive dissonance is getting set. And so that's also where atypical PTSD comes in. So the victim's brain attaches to the good memories, and they hope and believe that it's going to change or be different when they get love bombed yet again.
Right.
And they're being told that there's going to be change and that they're going to get help. And so typically, though, what happens the second the victim goes back, they're right back to bad behavior.
Right. Yep.
They only use the love bombing, but they play on the cognitive dissonance that's been set from the very beginning when the fantasy got created that this person was the soulmate, right? And so, so that happens, and then the PTSD has set in by this time, and so the victim has those positive memories that she goes back to and thinks, well, he was good that time, so maybe he really will change. And so it's all about the hope that things will be different and things will change. But that's where the enduring patterns come in, because oftentimes I'll have them recount back like 5, 10 years ago of what was different then. Oh, well, nothing was different. He was exactly the same, right? And that's because those enduring patterns don't ever change and they last over time. And so, but their brain is trying to recall the good memories. And so it's very much what's called cognitive dissonance, and it keeps them going back.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for joining me today, and I will look forward to continuing our discussion, because there's the one other wheel talking about the abuse that you can see happening, after they've actually separated. So there's a lot more for us to discuss here. So folks, please come back. Thank you very much for joining us today for the Reclamation Transformation. And don't forget, change begins with you. So leave your mark.